Was J.R.R. Tolkien a poor writer, or at least a mediocre writer? This is a thing I've heard claimed many times before. I think I first came across the claim when I started watching BookTube. People saying, I like the story, or cool characters, love the adaptation, but in the book itself, don't really like the writing. And I was reminded of this by seeing a tweet which was asking for great writers, really great writers. And someone said Tolkien, and the guy responded saying he's a great storyteller, but I don't think he's a great writer. He's kind of okay, mediocre. And this is someone who read, by the way, someone who, not like Tolkien was the first thing he'd ever read and hated it. He was saying, oh no, he's not a writer compared to like Nabokov or Melville, you know, if you want to talk about writers. And I just thought this is such an interesting controversy about, I mean, in The Lord of the Rings, the most important fantasy novel ever, the most significant fantasy novel ever. And some would say the greatest fantasy novel ever, the one of the great English language novels. And so I thought it was worth talking about, basically. It's not rare criticism. Lots of people feel like it. So it's not something that can be dismissed by saying, well, this one mad person said it. You have to respond to it in a serious way. Basically, people enjoy the story, but don't enjoy how it's written. And I think this can mean two things. I think it probably usually means one thing, which is people don't like the actual writing. But I think sometimes it can mean something else, which is about the structure and about the way the Lord of the Rings specifically is built. I think The Hobbit, let's say structurally, Hobbit is very orthodox structure, isn't it? It's a novel that has, it has 19 chapters, and virtually every chapter has one main problem that has to be resolved. In fact, that's the basic chapter structure. And it's a picaresque journey. So usually, in virtually all cases, there's a chapter which has a problem, you deal with the problem, and you move on to the next problem. And that even happens in the back end of the story. There is one passage of 3 chapters in the middle, which is about the dwarves at the mountain, particularly at the mountain, and trying to deal with getting in there from the back end of Warm Welcome, on the doorstep, inside information, not at home. Those last 3 chapters particularly, which are to do with the dwarves infiltrating the mountain. And they're connected, but everything else is basically standalone. And you can think it's childish or not enjoy it, but I think structurally, I don't think anyone's saying The Hobbit is structurally deficient. The Lord of the Rings, there are 2 big criticisms which you could see as writing criticisms, which are to do with the structure. And they are basically, I think, the 3 chapters concerning Tom Bombadil in The Fellowship of the Ring, and the split plot, the 2-pace plot in Two Towers and most of Return of the King, until they reunite. And these, I think, get criticised for different reasons. The reason they're relevant to our conversation, of course, is because they're matters of craft. If you think there's sections that don't work, whole sections that don't work, or if you think there's a big structural decision that doesn't work, you're criticising the writer as a craftsman, aren't you? Rather than as a storyteller or an imaginative guy, you're saying, no, this is artistically bad. And yeah, the criticisms are, I think, the Bombadil section gets lots of criticism for lots of reasons, some of which I've answered on this channel. I think it's an important discussion to have about what's going on with him. But to sum them up, beyond being a matter of taste, some people don't like characters or whatever, it's that it slows down the action or something like that. It seems irrelevant, and you think, when you think about the movie adaptations, think about the pacing problem that would come up if you have them being told you've got to go and take the ring to Elrond, and then they go to the Old Forest and there's all this stuff that happens, and it's not very threatening in terms of the mega plot. It seems detached from it. So there's this sense that it's structurally extraneous, and I think that's, why aren't they just getting straight off to Bree? That's the question you're asking. As well as if, you might not like the characters themselves or the poetry or whatever. But the split plot, on the other hand, is about the pacing. I think is that it's 2-paced. You have the War of the Ring, which is high octane, high action, relatively speaking. It travels all over the place. There's lots of great dealings, lots of characters. And then you have the Sam, Frodo and Gollum journey to Mordor, which is quite, relatively speaking, slow. It's intimate. It's closed in. The plots cross over with Faramir and the Window on the West. But the plots are, generally speaking, they're separated. and one seems a lot more exciting than the other. And I did feel, this is a criticism that people make, and I did actually feel the first two times I read Lord of the Rings, I did prefer the War of the Ring arc, and I did think there was a pacing issue with the Frodo, Sam and Gollum arc. So I can resonate with that. I always like the Bombadil stuff to some degree, but I can resonate with that second criticism at a personal level structurally. And I don't actually agree that either of these are structural problems now. I don't think they are significant problems about Tolkien's writing. They're certainly legitimate matters of taste. If you don't like them, that's entirely your right. You know, if you don't like Tom Bombadil, fair enough. But I mean, they're not technical failures of structure and decision of inclusion. I don't think Tolkien failed at the technical level with either the Bombadil section or the two-paced separation of the party. They're not weak beams in the cathedral that Tolkien is building. That's what I'm saying. And the Bombadil section, I think, has two clear literary purposes. So let's say, because the big question is about inclusion and somewhat about tone, it's the first threshold of exiting the safe Shire. It's an entry into this strange land beyond the boundary which the Rangers have been guarding. It's in a strange and dangerous world, and it's strange, fitting the strangeness of this experience. It's not just more of the same, but worse or more dangerous. Oh, well, we know about rain, but now there's floods. This is terrible. There's like talking trees that try to grab you. There's evil spirits living in barrows. There's a guy and his wife who live in the middle of nowhere who just hang out. It's unusual, and that means it's also wonderful. It gives us a sense of a world beyond the comfortable. And so it has that kind of storytelling purpose of being a first threshold that doesn't connect to the main plot in any strong sense. That itself is intentional too, because the hobbits aren't dealing with Mordor yet. They're not dealing with the ring race. They're dealing with the kind of minor, but to them amazingly big and troubling issues right on the border of the Shire. The conflict is not between, it's not between the big powers. It's between the hobbits and their own incompetence, really. And I think secondarily, this introduces what is really the well, let's say this. Tom Bombadil is a model of virtue, and this is a fixed point where we know what self-mastery means, and that's the key conflict, really, of the entire book. In terms of the key conflict is not between Sauron and Gondor, it's not between Isengard and Rohan, it's not between Gandalf kind of really masterminding the forces of good versus the Dark Lord or versus anything abstract either. You know, it's our desire to control the world versus our need to control ourselves. That's a key conflict, the key conflict morally in the story. And the Bombadil section is not superfluous for that, because Bombadil is our model of virtue, and Goldberry too. And we'll come back to some of that a bit actually, but the point is that structurally that's not extraneous. For myself, the Frodo and Sam plot came into focus, on the other hand, with age. Maybe it's an old man's story. It carries the weight of sorrowful experience with it. It is the clearest archetypal and legendary handling of Tolkien's war experiences, much more than the actual war you see fought. It's where you see no man's land and the dead marshes, and the wearing of wounds, the way in which they sap and destroy. And it seemed slow to me when I was young, because it is about suffering, not action, and my suffering had been juvenile to that point. Frodo, remember, I forget where the quote comes from, but his purpose in the story, he doesn't, we think, he's not very exciting, he doesn't do very much sometimes, but because he bears suffering so others don't have to. He does something so others don't have to. So that his part seems passive is beside the point. But yeah, my sufferings were juvenile. Now the section carries much more weight. It's literally necessary for the main plot. The ring needs to get destroyed somehow. But the form of it, the slow, dark pilgrimage, a pilgrimage not to somewhere good and wonderful, but somewhere dark and awful, is an intentional counterpoint to the great events of the war. Action and vigour are the tools of the forces of good as they ride between places, and they call people to fulfil their ghostly oaths, and they take a last council to go on a suicide mission. All this very dramatic and heroic stuff, whereas for Frodo's party, endurance of suffering and patience, the slow grinding away of the mind, paranoia creeps in. I think for Sam as well as for Frodo. Those are the perquisites for that entire section, and that's very tonally different. Each beat in both of those plots is both careful and intended structurally. So I don't think there are structural problems in The Lord of the Rings based on the most common criticisms. What about the actual writing? Because I think sometimes people do mean, I don't get why there's Tom Bombadil guys there. I think, remember, most of the criticisms about the Bombadil section are bafflement at the inclusion of this very strange and different section. But sometimes, and this is what I've heard more often, this is what this tweeter meant, I think, comparing to Nabokov and Melville, and it's, I think, what the majority of booktubers I've seen say it mean, because they say I read it and people said the writing's old-fashioned, it's ugly, maybe it's dull, there's a negative kind of connotation to all the way we talk about the writing. It's a lovely story, great, love the characters, but just the writing, I think, something dense. You see what I mean. I can only assume that there's something in the water though when I hear that. I think people's backgrounds, context do matter here. Like, what if someone's English second language and not really used to older English books? You can see there could be some experiential clash. But I basically think there has to be something in the water, because this is a patently insane opinion for the majority of people. Tolkien is one of the great stylists in English in the 20th century. It's not like he's a fantasy writer and you can like his style or not like his style. He's a bit like Brandon Sanderson, really, or Robert Jordan. No, you're talking about someone who is one of the finest prose stylists in English fiction, English language fiction in the 20th century, and is not like he's really, really acrid and difficult, like Cormac McCarthy, really beautiful but quite tough to read sometimes, or William Burroughs or whatever else. No, it's not even that. You're talking about someone who's reasonably easy to read in terms of normal English vocabulary. I don't mean you always find it easy to read, but I just mean if we're talking about vocabulary tests and stuff. So I do wonder whether there's probably lots of reasons why people react like that to Tolkien's writing style, which is that may be experience, it may be their taste elsewhere, and they're translating taste in terms of liking particular styles of writing into a blanket judgment about form and the mechanical underpinning of writing. But I think people probably simply don't like the things he writes about. That's probably often the case, isn't it? In a sense, it's a structural complaint too. People complain or joke that Tolkien will spend 10 pages on describing a tree and then 1 page on the battle that happens next to the tree. And if it's true, one sees the kernel of the truth there. What you have to ask, I think, is not, shouldn't think, that means Tolkien's very bad at writing. You should wonder whether Tolkien thinks trees are 10 times more important than battles, and if so, why? It's probably intentional. But if it's about the actual way he writes things, so it's not about kind of what he writes about, I don't like fantasy stories, or I don't like nature journeys. If it's about the actual writing, we should consider a few examples. I think that's going to be a good way to just work it out, and I think hopefully it'll be enjoyable. We'll hear some good text, and I'll read the sections and then make a few comments. I think that's the way I want to do it. I'm going to stick to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I think The Silmarillion has some great writing in it too. The Silmarillion, I think, is genre-wise difficult for people not used to things beyond traditional fantasy. But it is a beautifully written book. But I'm going to stick to the 2 big books, the 2 ones published in his lifetime. We could also look at the short stories, obviously, as well. Let's go. This is in chapter 12, Inside Information, I believe. 2. So, Bilbo has just re-entered. He's got a cup and shown it to the dwarves, and he's re-entered to scout out more. And Smaug is awake, it turns out. Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along, help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare. But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. "No, thank you, oh Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wish to have a look at you and see if you are truly as great as tales say. I did not believe them." "Do you now?" said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. "Truly songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities," replied Bilbo. "You have nice manners for a thief and a liar," said the dragon. "You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you, and where do you come from, may I ask?" "You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air. I am he that walks unseen." "So I can well believe," said Smaug, "but that is hardly your usual name." "I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number." "Lovely titles," sneered the dragon, "but lucky numbers don't always come off. I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them out alive again from the water. I came from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me." "These don't seem so creditable," scoffed Smaug. "I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider," went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. "That's better," said Smaug, "but don't let your imagination run away with you." Isn't that fun? There are lots of outright funny bits in The Hobbit. I think the setup for getting Bjorn to let all the dwarves stay with him by saying, "I've just got a few friends to come," and then a couple of dwarves turn up and then and they introduce themselves, and then it turns out there's more behind them, is a genuinely laugh out loud thing. There are some really funny things, and there's some touching moments, and there's exciting moments. There's a wonderful, wonderful book. But this section is a nice blend, I think, of a few things that Tolkien is good at. The danger Smaug presents, there's a genuine kind of, you understand this is a dangerous moment, and Smaug is impressive, but it's undercut by Bilbo's inventiveness and his joy in words. It's a really joyful section. Bilbo is pleased with his riddling, and so are we. And it's an adept building on Bilbo's character and on the plot. He's a riddler, and so he riddles, and we know of the many deeds that have turned him from a chubby homebody into a burglar, into a fine burglar, and so we know he isn't lying here. It is like, I come from the end of the bag, but no bag went over me. Tolkien selects words and pace and tone very carefully to make this physical mismatch a rather joyous intellectual match. It's something where this tiny hobbit becomes the equal of this ancient and cunning worm. And it's just really fun. I think, I'm thinking, imagine reading The Hobbit and not enjoying that. Imagine thinking that childish in the pejorative sense. Anyway, let's go to two selections from The House of Tom Bombadil in the Fellowship of the Ring. So, the first is from when they've arrived and Frodo is, Tom's off doing jobs and Frodo's just talking to Goldberry. "Fair lady," said Frodo again after a while, "tell me, if my asking does not seem foolish, who is Tom Bombadil?" He is, said Goldberry, staying her swift movements and smiling. Frodo looked at her questioningly. "He is, as you have seen him," she said in answer to his look. "He is the master of wood, water, and hill. Then all this strange land belongs to him." "No, indeed," she answered, and her smile faded. "That would indeed be a burden," she added in a low voice, as if to herself. "The trees and the grass, and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master." A door opened, and in came Tom Bombadil. He had now no hat, and his thick brown hair was crowned with autumn leaves. He laughed, and going to Goldberry took her hand. "Here's my pretty lady," he said, bowing to the hobbits. "Here's my Goldberry, clothed all in silver green, with flowers in her girdle. Is the table laden? I see yellow cream and honeycomb, and white bread and butter, milk, cheese, and green herbs, and ripe berries gathered. Is that enough for us? Is the supper ready?" Two things here. One, the exceptional ability to condense meaning and weight into a few words, and not obvious hackneyed words, as Goldberry does when she sets up the whole dynamic of mastery that is the heart of the moral tension of the book. Think about how obvious or cliched you might find the moral message in an interesting, fun fantasy book that you love, you really enjoy, but it's a bit heavy-handed. Really, Hammer, tells you what you need to know about the morals of the story and of the characters. But here, Frodo's just like, who is this weird guy who's just rescued us? And Goldberry says, oh, he is. And of course, we think of, is this a divine epithet? He's probably not. He's almost certainly not Ariel Iluvatar. But the point is he God, or is there something divine about him? Is there something divine about him in connection to the land, perhaps? And then Frodo still doesn't get that. And then she says, well, he's master of wood and water and hill. And so Frodo thinks, oh, well, that just means that he's in charge of it. He owns it. He's a landlord. And Goldberry says no, and gives this rather touching idea or moving idea of all these things being master of themselves, and that to be master of all this is to be fully Tom, whatever that is. That's for another discussion. But then you also have this ability to switch tone, and I'll reread just that section from Tom without the verbal description of what he does. Here's my pretty lady, here's my Goldberry clothed all in silver green with flowers in her girdle. Is the table laden? Icy yellow cream and honeycomb and white bread and butter, milk, cheese and green herbs and ripe berries gathered. Is that enough for us? Is the supper ready? It's prose, but it is punctuated and paced to sound to us like poetry. And when you read some of Tolkien's poetry, you'll see there are poems that obviously are based on the same metre, but actually set properly into verse. Tom, even when he's speaking to you, is singing. And that's very important thematically for Tom's character, of course, and for what he represents. And I think, generally speaking, by the way, what poetry represents in Lord of the Rings. So I think that's a really good example of the fact that he's actually quite economical with style. Lots happens in the Lord of the Rings, in 1,200 pages, 1,100 pages of fairly normal-sized prose. A vast amount more happens than in the same length of many other writers. And it's because he's able to condense meaning into these really juicy, meaty sections. The other section from The House of Tom Bombadil I want to read is On the Rainy Day. Basically, which is apparently Goldberry's washing day, which is an interesting thing to say, isn't it? Anyway, Tom, they just hang out. They're going to hang out. The hobbits can't travel. He then told them many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them suddenly with a bright blue eye under his deep brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of the chair and dance about. He told them tales of bees and flowers, the ways of trees and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under brambles. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest, apart from themselves, indeed to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home. Moving constantly in and out of his talk was Old Man Willow, and Frodo learned now enough to content him, indeed more than enough, for it was not comfortable lore. Tom's words laid bare the hearts of trees and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange, and filled with a hatred of things that go free upon the earth. Gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning, destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived yet, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom, and with malice. But there were none more dangerous than the great willow. His heart was rotten, but his strength was green, and he was cunning, and a master of winds, and his song and thought ran through the woods on both sides of the river. His grey, thirsty spirit drew power out of the earth and spread like fine root threads in the ground, and invisible twig fingers in the air, till it had under its dominion nearly all the trees of the forest, from the hedges to the downs. Suddenly Tom's talk left the woods and went leaping up the young stream, over bubbling waterfalls, over pebbles and worn rocks, and among small flowers, in close grass and wet crannies, wandering at last up onto the downs. They heard of the great barrows and the green mounds and the stone rings upon the hills and in the hollows among the hills. Sheep were bleating in flocks, green walls and white walls rose. There were fortresses on the heights. Kings of little kingdoms fought together, and the young sun shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords. There was victory and defeat, and towers fell, fortresses were burned, and flames went up into the sky. Gold was piled on the biers of dead kings and queens, and mounds covered them, and the stone doors were shut, and the grass grew over all. Sheep walked for a while, biting the grass, but soon the hills were empty again. A shadow came out of dark places far away, and the bones were stirred in the mounds. Barrow wights walked in hollow places with a clink of rings on gold fingers, and gold chains in the wind. Stone rings grinned out of the ground like broken teeth in the moonlight. The hobbits shuddered. Even in the Shire, the rumour of the Barrow wights, of the Barrow Downs beyond the forest, had been heard, but it was not a tale that any hobbit liked to listen to. Even by a comfortable fireside far away, these four now suddenly remembered what the joy of this house had driven from their minds. The house of Tom Bombadil nestled under the very shoulders of those dreaded hills. They lost the thread of his tale and shifted uneasily, looking aside at one another. This is three things at once. It's exposition of what comes next. It's writing about nature and human alienation from it, a big theme in Tolkien. The humans are the aliens in this forest, our hobbits being humans. It's the telling of a dark children's fairy tale that covers the history of Eriador. Again, incredibly densely packed and stylistically varied. Tolkien is a master of voice and of moving between tones and voices. This is very different to Tom enjoying talking about the food, isn't it? It's very different to, the great battle stories, and it's very different to the talking amongst the hobbits. I think, I think hopefully we've picked up this thing of tonal variety and flexibility in Tolkien. Next, we'll go to the Two Towers, to Book 4, The Stairs of Cirith Ungol, which is just before Shelob's lair. So the storm at last has burst at last. The War of the Ring has fully started in the south, and the army of Minas Morgul is marching on Osgiliath. And they're travelling, they're going up, trying to find the tunnel, and Gollum, I think, is scouting the tunnel, possibly, or is just out on watch, in fact. And Frodo says, I don't like anything here at all, said Frodo. Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air and water all seem accursed, but so our path is laid. He is there to endure suffering. Yes, that's so, said Sam, and we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started, but I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures, as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of a sport, as you might say, but that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them, usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it, but I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those who just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you, at least not to what folks inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into. I wonder, said Frodo. But I don't know, and that's the way of a real tale. Take any one you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know. And you don't want them to. No, sir, of course not. Beren now, he never thought he was going to get the Silmaril from the Iron Crown and Thangorodrim, and yet he did, and that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Eärendil, and why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo, but the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later, or sooner. And then we can have some rest and some sleep, said Sam. You've got two very distinct voices. This is character voice captured here in a very weighty piece of dialogue. It's not dry exposition of an idea. Oh, well, great tales. Isn't it interesting that, there's these Jungian archetypes flowing through history, or look at all these stories are the same. The kind of things I say very boringly. This is putting some big ideas into characters and fitting them around those characters. Sam loves tales. He's always listened to Master Bilbo. He loves these stories. He's full of them. He has an endless desire for them, and hence why he's able to reflect on the fact that people think they want adventure, but actually adventure just happens to you, it turns out. Frodo speaks, and Sam has, by the way, these tics, doesn't he? He has that great double negative. Don't the great tales never end? He's always asking questions. He's always circling back on himself. Frodo speaks partly because he's tired and wounded and injured in a shorter fashion, but in a quite poetic manner, I think. Take anyone I don't know, and that's the way of a real tale. But the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later or sooner. There's a quite laconic, again, maybe because he's tired, but quite poignant and poetic tone to Frodo. And so you've got this, and it's reflecting on obviously something to do with Tolkien's idea of fairy stories, and of just what fiction does for us. It also is structurally important. It connects you to 9,000 years of history in the past, structurally, all the way back to Beren and Thangorodrim, all the way back to the making of and theft of the Silmarils. But it also sets you up for the encounter with Shelob, by the mention of the Glass of Eärendil, and for Sam's great moment of hope on the top of the Tower of Cirith Ungol, which is where he sees the stars and the great Order of Vada and the light of Eärendil in the stars, which things should he seem darkest then. So this is connected structurally to lots of other things, and it's serving lots of purposes, and it's executing that through character, not through dump. Finally, our final example is in Return of the King. It is the Ride of the Rohirrim. Here we go. After a while, the king led his men away somewhat eastward, to come between the fires of the siege and the outer fields. Still they were unchallenged, and still Theoden gave no signal. At last he halted once again. The city was now nearer. A smell of burning was in the air, and a very shadow of death. The horses were uneasy, but the king sat upon Snowmane, motionless, gazing upon the agony of Minas Tirith, as if stricken suddenly by anguish or by dread. He seemed to shrink down, cowed by age. Merry himself felt as if a great weight of horror and doubt had settled on him. His heart beat slowly. Time seemed poised in uncertainty. They were too late. Too late was worse than never. Perhaps Theoden would quail, bow his old head, turn, slink away to hide in the hills. Then suddenly Merry felt it at last, beyond doubt. A change. Wind was in his face. Light was glimmering. Far, far away in the south, the clouds could be dimly seen as remote grey shapes rolling up, drifting. Morning lay beyond them. But at that same moment there was a flash, as if lightning had sprung from the earth beneath the city. For a searing second it stood dazzling far off in black and white, its topmost tower like a glittering needle, and then as the darkness closed again, there came rolling over the fields a great boom. At that sound the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups he cried in a loud voice more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter! Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor! With that he seized a great horn from Guthlaf his banner-bearer, and he blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like a storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains. Ride now, ride now, ride to Gondor. Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind, white horse upon a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horsetail on his helm floating in his speed, and the front of the first Aerid roared like a breaker foaming to the shore, but Theoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. His golden shield was uncovered, and lo, it shone like an image of the sun, and the grass flamed into green about the white feet of his steed. For morning came, morning and a wind from the sea, and darkness was removed, and the hosts of Mordor wailed, and the terror took them, and they fled and died, and the hoofs of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing that was fair and terrible came even to the city. The facility Tolkien has to switch sentence structure and type from the slow moments of anxiety in the ordinary narrative voice of Merry, this concern of fairly ordinary narrative prose, to this battle song form of writing, this mythical tone, the flow-on sentences with many commas, the mythical references, the conscious echoes of the poetic sound of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and of the visuals of Anglo-Saxon poetry as well. The savage pagan glory, baptized pagan glory of them singing as they slay. The joy of battle was on them. This is exceptionally evocative, this fair and terrible image of a war host of Saxons singing as they slay. If Tolkien has bad style in his writing, I confess I do not know the meaning of the words. It's something I think is quite reasonable for someone not to enjoy a piece of writing. That's something I can't legislate. But Tolkien is amongst the most able, flexible, skillful writers that have ever written fiction in the English language. His ability to move voice, his ability to capture different themes and periods and places, and character voice, his ability nearly unmatched. His ability to evoke emotion, humour, and delight, and sympathy and fear, and rather more difficult and savage emotions, as we find in that passage, again, nearly unmatched. So I hope that we've got some sense of why Tolkien can be perhaps criticised for many things. You may not like his ideas, you may not like the things he writes about, you may prefer other writers. That's certainly very reasonable. But one thing that cannot be said of him, I think, is that he is a bad writer. Tell me what you think. Tell me why you think he's such a terrible writer in the comments, and I'll see you next time.